Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Fellowshow. I'm your host, the Fellow KGB. You can follow me on Twitter at the Fellow KGB. And today we're going to be looking at my wide receiver rankings. I've already covered the running backs, the quarterbacks, and the tight ends, so you can check those out later if you have not already. But yeah, we're going to dive right into it. We're going to be using my Google Sheets document, which you can access on Patreon. And we're kind of just going to walk through my wide receiver ones, my wide receiver twos in depth, and we'll kind of start looking at the wide receiver threes and fours that I think we need to keep an eye on that could be sleepers. But yeah, let's hop right into it. And of course, I mean, it's pretty easy. You're going to find Michael Thomas at the top of pretty much everyone's rankings in PPR. I'm going to be talking about these in terms of PPR. So that's just kind of how most of my leagues play out. So I'm going to go ahead here and just highlight Michael Thomas's numbers. I got him projected for 123 receptions, 169 targets, just over 1,400 yards and 8 touchdowns. Let's take a look at what he did last year real quick. I'm going to be a little quick with Michael Thomas. I shouldn't have to convince you to take Michael Thomas. He had a record-setting year in 2019, 185 targets, 149 receptions, 1,725 yards, and 9 touchdowns. He had a massive 31.84% target share. He had a huge yard share and opportunity share for the Saints as well. So I guess in terms of this year, I have that number coming down a little bit. I got him at 28% target share. I do have him at 21.75% yard share. So I do have his numbers coming down a little bit, and he's still coming out as the wide receiver one. I think there's going to be a little bit more competition for targets since they did add Emmanuel Sanders. Jared Cook should be healthy, hopefully for the whole season. So I just have his numbers coming down a little bit as teams basically they're going to be like, Michael Thomas, that's the guy to take away. You can try to take him away, but I just think with the addition of Sanders, his numbers will come down just a little bit. But again, still good enough to be my wide receiver one in my rankings. At wide receiver two, I have Davante Adams. Davante only played 12 games last year, but he played pretty well. His touchdowns were low. He only scored 5 touchdowns in 12 games. So typically we've seen him over double-digit touchdowns. So I have him returning to 10 touchdowns. I have him tied for league best in touchdowns. We'll kind of talk on that a little bit. But I think I have 4 players projected for double-digit touchdowns, and he's one of them. So I got him. Outside of Michael Thomas, I think he's the safest to project for a potential league leader in targets. Green Bay did not add a receiver. The one that they did add, Devin Funchess, he's opted out for the season. So I got Davante Adams at 165 targets, 107 receptions, 1,280 yards, and 10 touchdowns. He's at 28.21% target share, and I think that edges out Michael Thomas. He just beats Michael Thomas in target share, but I think Thomas gets him in yard share. So I got Thomas being one of the best yard producers in the league, whereas Davante Adams, he's going to score more touchdowns probably than Michael Thomas. Thomas is just going to get a little bit more volume, probably a little bit more receptions. But you really can't go wrong. If you're looking to take Davante Adams, he's somewhere in the 7, 8, 9 range. If you can get him at the end of the first round, that's fantastic. But if we look at what Davante did last year in his 12 games, I'll pull up his numbers in a bit. But on the season, in 12 games, we see 127 targets. So that's over 10 targets per game, 83 receptions, just under 1,000 yards, and 5 touchdowns. But if you look at his game log from last year, and I know it's from the actual playoffs, not any fantasy season games, but look at what he did the last 5 games of the season, starting in week 15, just massive numbers in PPR leagues. He absolutely blew up Seattle Seahawks from probably one of his best games that I've seen him play. And then you just look at the targets. The lowest targeted game was 11. He did have the blip in the radar here against Washington week 14 with only 6 targets. That was kind of a down game. But every other game that he played was pretty much, it took him a little bit to get going. And then when he got healthy again, he really came on strong. And I think he's going to be a target hog. You're going to probably looking at 10, 11 targets per game. And he's a really safe bet. And after you miss out on some of the running backs, I think Davante is one of my favorite values at the end of the first round. So he's been a guy that's been ending up on a lot of my teams as I sit in the back end of the first. My wide receiver 3, Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill missed some games last year too. And if we look at, I'm using fftoday.com. That's where I get a lot of my stats. But if I filter by fantasy points per game, you're going to see Tyreek Hill is low. His numbers are misleading. It says he played in 12 games. But I know for a fact 2 of these games, week 1 against Jacksonville and week 11 against the Chargers, he had to leave in the first quarter. So his numbers should be a lot higher than what they are. So when you factor in that he only played in 10 full games, and you see 188.3 fantasy points. That's basically 18.8 fantasy points per game, which would have put him basically wide receiver 3. So that's where I have him penciled in right now. Again, you're attaching yourself to Patrick Mahomes, which is not a bad thing at all. I have him being at 14.8 yards per reception, 86 catches, 132 targets, 1,270 yards, and 10 touchdowns. It was pretty amazing. I guess he only played the 10 full games, like I said, but he did catch 7 touchdowns. So that's a pretty impressive ratio there. So again, you're getting one of the best, most dynamic receivers and one of the best offenses with one of the best quarterbacks. If I'm sitting there at 12, I have a hard time passing up on Tyreek Hill twice. So I don't mind snagging him if you can get them there. Wide receiver 4, Julio Jones. I have him projected for 95 receptions, 151 targets, 1,325 yards, and 8 touchdowns. The thing with Julio is he's not a touchdown guy. He's only going to get about 7, 8, 9 maybe. It's been a while since we've seen him get double-digit touchdowns. But last year he did score. He scored 6. But he's all about the receptions and the yards. He had 99 catches for almost 1,400 yards. So that's where you're going to get most of your money with Julio. And we do see on a points per game basis last year, he was wide receiver 3. The man's been healthy for a long time. He hasn't really missed time since 2013. But his touchdowns, that's what we're kind of talking about. He's only had one career season over double-digit touchdowns. So it looks like he's in the 6 to 8 touchdown range. So if you think he can beat 8 touchdowns, he's probably going to get a really good chance at being a top maybe 1, 2, or 3 receiver this year. So I don't need to sell you on Julio Jones. I'd prefer not to take him in the first round if I can. I think I'd rather get a running back there. But in the second round, early second round, I'm going to sign off on Julio Jones there. In Atlanta, I don't really know. I can't really trust Atlanta to be a good football team yet. So we should see them throwing the ball quite a bit. So my wide receiver 5, Chris Godwin. And Chris Godwin, he blew things up last year. If you were following any of my stuff on fantasyfellowship.com last year, you probably would have ended up with Chris Godwin a lot on your teams. And he finished as the wide receiver 2, and he even missed some games. I think that was what was really impressive to me. He did average the second most fantasy points per game. And then even then, I guess Julio tied him in total PPR points, but he finished as the wide receiver 2, and he only played 14 games. So that's pretty impressive to me. And then when you factor in going from Jameis Winston to Tom Brady, it's pretty easy to see what Tom Brady likes to do with the ball. He likes to get the ball out of his hands quickly. He's going to work in the middle of the field, and that's where Chris Godwin can dominate. Mike Evans, on the other hand, deep throws on the outside, 50-50 balls. Tom Brady's been good with that in the past, but his deep ball isn't as good as it used to be. So I think Chris Godwin's going to be the leading receiver again this year in Tampa Bay. Got him going for 95 receptions, 138 targets, 1,235 yards, and 9 touchdowns, which is basically where he's at last year. I didn't even try to do that, but I have him at 274 points. And that's actually like factoring in some downside with Chris Godwin, because as good as he played last year, he only missed 2 games. So I basically got him, being a slight notch down, which could be, I don't know, he could be a value. He's one of my favorite round 2 receivers to get. Sometimes he falls to me at the end of the second round. Like there's been times where I drafted him 24th, 25th overall. If he gets to that point, don't even think about it. Just slam Chris Godwin on the draft button, and you got a top 5 receiver. So those are my top 5. And I feel really, really good about those guys having high odds and probability of being top 5 receivers. Everything after that, it's kind of guesswork. But I feel really confident in those guys. So my wide receiver 6, this is where, these guys are all, basically 6 through 12. They can all be interchangeable for the most part. I have Juju Smith-Schuster up here at wide receiver 6. That's just because I'm super optimistic in the Steelers offense, and I hope Ben Roethlisberger and James Conner can stay healthy. Because if everyone stays healthy there, I think we're kind of not slightly, like we are underrating the Steelers' offensive ceiling this year for fantasy. So Juju's going to be the primary slot receiver. They're going to use Deontay Johnson. They might mix Deontay in the slot, but Deontay and James Washington on the outside. And both those guys improved last year. I think Washington led the team in yards, and Deontay led them in receptions. So they got some really good young talent there on the outside, and Juju's going to do his thing in the middle. I got him going for 97 receptions, 151 targets, almost 1,200 yards, and 8 touchdowns. And again, I kind of project players for their ceiling. So I think in the third round, Juju Smith-Schuster, a lot of these guys that I'm going to be talking about coming up are going to be, for me, if I see them in the third round, I kind of automatically do it. And they're kind of tiered a little bit. Because I'm going to take Juju over Allen Robinson. I might even take Adam Thielen over Allen Robinson. But these guys, I see a lot of these guys, these four, Juju, Allen Robinson, Adam Thielen, DJ Moore, I could interchange them. Wide receivers 6 through 9, I think they all have a really good chance at top 10 receiver finishes this year. And it's more of a preference play. You kind of got to do what you think is comfortable. If you think Adam Thielen being the single man over there now, and you like Kirk Cousins, the connection there, that might be the best option. But I really like all these guys in the third round. So Juju's my 6th, Allen Robinson's my 7th. When you think about Allen Robinson, his 2019 season, he was wide receiver 7, and this is with a full season of Mitchell Trubisky, which is pretty crazy. We see Allen Robinson with a handful of 100-yard games. He did, have a mean streak here, and he finished the season really strong. He had a couple low games. It happens to everybody, but he did finish the season really strong. And he was a wide receiver 1, wide receiver 7, in fact. So he comes in again at wide receiver 7 for me. I think Nick Foles can hit him a little bit more on time and a little bit more efficiently than Trubisky was doing. So I'm a big fan of Allen Robinson. And again, wide receiver 7 last year. Maybe the numbers come down a little bit as the Bears look to spread the ball a little bit more with Anthony Miller. They got the new tight end, Jimmy Graham. And they got a couple other younger receivers and Tariq Cohen, of course. So maybe Nick Foles spreads it around a little bit more. But still, I think he's got a really good opportunity at being a top 10 receiver and a wide receiver 1 for you. Adam Thielen is one of the most interesting guys in my top 10 for me, because if you filter by target share, he's going to be up here at my 3rd best wide receiver. Minnesota's not going to have a lot of passing attempts. That offense is traditionally a run-first offense, and they're going to throw the ball when they need to. But with Stephon Diggs gone, bringing in rookie Justin Jefferson, I just think Adam Thielen's going to eat. He's going to get a lot of targets. And I got him at 130 targets, 87 catches, about 1,200 yards and 8 touchdowns. But again, that target share, he's going to be easily Kirk Cousins' go-to weapon. And he was coming off the injury last year, but if you look at his numbers real quick, he did not really have a good season at all because of the hamstring injury. I'm looking for him here. So he finished as wide receiver 65, only averaged 11.4 points per game, but he's coming off of some massive seasons. You look at these numbers, like these could be his numbers. He could average anywhere between 15 and 19 fantasy points this year. But in the games that he did play, he started off the season fine. I don't know what happened here against Chicago. Sometimes that happens against Chicago. But if you had him the first 6 weeks of the year, he was on pace to be a top 10 receiver. And then the hamstring injury happens. I think early in the game against Detroit, he ends up missing a lot of time. I don't really know if he's playing at full strength weeks 15 and 16, but week in the first round of the playoffs, we see him blow up against the Saints and help them beat the Saints. And then, of course, San Francisco, they kind of just wreck receivers and offenses in general. But he did come back strong, so I'm not really too worried about the injury from last year. And again, he's my 3rd highest receiver in terms of target share. In terms of yard share, I think he was my number 2 receiver, which yard share is the total amount of yards a player accounts for. So I got Thielen going for 10 rushing yards and 1,200 receiving yards. So that's 1,210. And then you divide that number by the total amount of yards the Vikings offense gets. So that means for every 100 yards, Adam Thielen's going to get about 21 of those. So the research that I did with the yard share, which you can find on thefantasyfellowship.com, is the higher the yard share a player is responsible for, the more likely they are to finish, higher in the list as a PPR finish. So that's an interesting stat that I like to look at. But anyways, we got a lot of NFC North receivers. We got 3 of them in the top 8 here, so that's pretty interesting. And then Kenny Galladay's lingering down here. But my 9th receiver is going to be DJ Moore. Let's take a look at where he finished last year real quick. Go back one more time. And DJ Moore, wide receiver 15 last year. He played 15 games, 135 targets, 87 receptions, 1,175 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns. He also added a little bit on the ground here, which is nice. But now he gets Teddy Bridgewater. He played with Kyle Allen all last year. I think Cam Newton played the game and a half or whatever. So there's an upgrade at quarterback. We get a new offensive system here. That's, it's Matt Rule and Kyle Brady. I think his name's Kyle, but Brady from LSU. So the offensive is going to be, I think it's going to be more run and gun, where they're going to be getting quick throws out. They're going to be throwing the ball a little bit more than I think we expect them to. And when you think about the LSU offense with Joe Burrow and Justin Jefferson, they favored the slot receiver heavily, and they're going to take their deep shots and they're going to be creative with, Curtis Samuel and Robbie Anderson. But DJ Moore is in for a career year, I think, with targets, receptions, yards, and his touchdowns. He's never been a touchdown guy in the 2 years that he's been in the league. You see only 2 and 4. So I think if I had to bet DJ Moore is going to score more than 4 touchdowns, he has all it takes is 5 touchdowns. So that's not that big of a number for him to get. But if he ends up with 8, 9, 10 touchdowns this year, I mean, he's got top 5 receiver upside. So I love DJ Moore. I think with Teddy Bridgewater, he's going to be his favorite receiver easily in the slot. Teddy Bridgewater excelled with Michael Thomas last year. So I think it's going to be a pretty good situation. So I love DJ Moore in the 3rd. And then my wide receiver 10 is Robert Woods. With the Rams, Brandon Cooks is out of town. Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods take the majority of the targets. And you see Robert Woods here finished as wide receiver 14 in only 15 games. Almost 140 targets, 90 receptions, 1,134 yards, and just 2 touchdowns, 2 receiving touchdowns. But the thing about Robert Woods is the man can run. He had 17 carries last year, 115 yards and a touchdown. So he's basically getting, one end around or one kind of run a game. And he's one of the best running receivers in the league. Deebo Samuel might have something to say about that, maybe Curtis Samuel too. But Robert Woods, he's going to get his rushing attempts. And then the cool part about Robert Woods is he's been doing this for 2 years now. He was wide receiver 10 2 years ago, 2018. And again, you look at these rushing numbers where he's getting 19 carries, 157 yards, and a touchdown, and then he's going to get the volume. So I love everything about Robert Woods. He's one of my favorite volume plays. Let me undo that. And if we look at target share here, you're going to see Robert Woods. Let's see, where did he go? Target share. Where did Robert Woods go? I mean, I got him down here at wide receiver 19. What about opportunity share? So Robert Woods is up here at my 6th best opportunity share, which is targets and rushing attempts combined divided by the total number of plays an offensive has. So I have him 6th best there. And in terms of yard share, he comes in at wide receiver 8. So he's cracking the top 10 in 2 of my most important metrics that I like to use. So it's super impressive what he's been doing lately. And just with Brandon Cooks gone, Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods are going to step into bigger roles this year. And as you saw, wide receiver 10 and wide receiver 14 the last 2 years. I got him as wide receiver 10 this year, or wide receiver 11, I guess. I skipped DeAndre Hopkins. So DeAndre Hopkins is my wide receiver 10. I'm a little bit lower than DeAndre Hopkins than most people. He typically goes somewhere in round 2. Anytime that I'm up in round 2, I'm taking Chris Godwin over him, or I'm taking a running back. So I don't really get Hopkins a lot on any of my teams right now. And the thing is, because I have these guys, Juju, Allen Robinson, Adam Thielen, DJ Moore, ranked ahead of DeAndre Hopkins, I tend to wait to the 3rd round to grab a receiver if I want one instead of taking Hopkins. But I am high on DeAndre Hopkins in the new Cardinals offense. They got him at 89 catches, 135 targets, 1,160 receiving yards, and 8 touchdowns. I think he takes a slight step back in production because I think Deshaun Watson Deshaun Watson's a 3rd-year, 4th-year quarterback. I think Watson's got a little bit more to offer as a thrower than Kyler Murray. I think it might be some inconsistent weeks for DeAndre Hopkins on a weekly basis. And we really don't know what to expect. It's going to be a new offense. I think they're going to do a lot of good things to scheme DeAndre Hopkins open. The volume should be somewhat similar, but we see last year this team targeted Larry Fitzgerald and Christian Kirk 109 and 107 times. So I have a hard time wrapping my head around how this target share is going to be split. So, I decreased Kirks and Fitzgerald, but I still have a lot of targets for Hopkins. So I really don't know how this is going to shake down. But again, I have him as a low-end wide receiver 1. Take him, I guess, if he falls at the end of round 2 and you're a Cardinals fan, I think that's fine. We already talked about Robert Woods. And then my final wide receiver 1 here is Kenny Galladay. And Kenny Galladay's got a massive upside. Last year, we see Kenny Galladay. Let's see where he finished. PPR. That's 2018. In 2019, Kenny Galladay, wide receiver 9. And this is with only 8 games from Matthew Stafford. He finished with 116 targets, 65 receptions, almost 1,200 yards, and 11 touchdowns. He led the NFL in receiving touchdowns. and he's got a really good chance at doing it again this year. I think, yep, he is one of those receivers that I have projected for double-digit touchdowns. The guys that I have double-digit touchdown projections for are Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Kenny Galladay, and A.J. Brown. And then let's just take a look at his game chart from last year. So he averaged 15.6 fantasy points per game. He's been steadily ramping up career highs, and I guess he stepped back in receptions, but his yards per catch were phenomenal last year. And he's going to have, a stinker game every now and then, but you see a lot of 20-point games, steady touchdowns every other week almost, and a couple double touchdown games. So Kenny Galladay, man, I have him as the wide receiver 12. You can get him somewhere. Sometimes I have a hard time deciding with Kenny Galladay when I get the first overall pick, and then it comes back to me and I have the 24th and 25th. I think that's probably the best spot to get him because I have a hard time passing on him twice there. So Kenny Galladay, man, I think he's one of the best receivers that you can get at that point in the draft. He's got a top 5 upside if he keeps getting more touchdowns. And Matt Stafford, the connection's really good there. And they're not going to be a good defense this year, so they should be throwing the ball a lot as normal. So that's my top 12 wide receivers. And we'll move on here to the wide receiver 2s. And this is where I start to get excited because I try to get, at least I usually can get a top 5 guy, whether if I have a late first round pick, I could get Devontae, I could get Chris Godwin in the second round. We talked about these guys here that I like to get in the third round. But these are some of the guys that present a lot of value for me in the 4th, 5th, 6th round sometimes. So I have Amari Cooper here as my wide receiver 13, 81 targets or 81 receptions, 124 targets, almost 1,200 yards, and 8 touchdowns. If we look at what Amari Cooper did last year, well, first of all, the man got paid, so that's great for him. He was wide receiver 10 last year. And if we look on his game logs, he did have a career best 15.4 fantasy points per game, career high in touchdowns, career high in yards per catch, career high in yards, almost a career high in receptions, and almost a career high in targets. But the problem with Amari Cooper is when it's good, it's so damn good, but when it's bad, it's so damn bad. You see this big zero burger here against the Patriots, only 2 targets in that game. Weeks 15 and 16, that's championship, weekends basically, trying to get to the championship, and then week 16 is the final game. 2.9 and 6.4, that's just not good enough for me. And I lost one of my week 15 games because of this 2.9 stinker, unfortunately. But it's a lot of inconsistencies. I love watching Amari Cooper play. When he goes off, man, he goes off. You see what he did here against Green Bay. He lit Minnesota up for a huge game. And Dak loves to throw to him. 119 targets, almost 80 receptions. But I got him coming in at wide receiver 13. He was a top 10 wide receiver last year. With CeeDee Lamb being added to the mix, it kind of muddies the waters a little bit, but I think he's going to get mostly Randall Cobb's work. And let me just look at the Dallas Cowboy offense is super interesting to project because now you add CeeDee Lamb. But Randall Cobb last year, 83 targets, 55 receptions, 828 yards and 3 touchdowns. I basically just was able to replace Cobb's name with CeeDee Lamb. And because Jason Witten is gone, I took some of Jason Witten's numbers and sprinkled them in amongst Cooper, Gallup, and CeeDee Lamb. So I ended up with basically CeeDee Lamb coming in at almost 100 targets, Michael Gallup coming in at 117, and Cooper leading the way. Cooper also leads the team in receptions, targets, yards. I have him tied with Michael Gallup in touchdowns. But yeah, the Dallas offense is one of the best passing offenses you can get attached to. But Cooper, for me, he hasn't been winding up on a lot of my teams. He's typically a 3rd round pick. And when I'm up in the 3rd round, I'm looking for Juju, Allen Robinson, Adam Thielen, DJ Moore. Easily, those are the guys that I'd rather have because I think they just have clear paths to value. They all have less competition. And I just like the yard share, the target shares, all those numbers that I talked about. So he's my wide receiver at 13. Mike Evans, wide receiver 14. This feels kind of low, but it's kind of like a guess because I really don't know how Tom Brady and Mike Evans are going to hook up as frequently as with Jameis Winston because Winston would just let it fly and Mike Evans had no problem going after it. But I don't think Tom Brady's going to take as many risks. I think Brady's going to pepper Godwin with the short area targets and then look for Mike Evans when he's open. But I got Evans going for 79 catches, 135 targets, over 1,200 yards and 8 touchdowns, which is a fantastic season, That's 248.5 fantasy points in PPR. Let's take a look at where Mike Evans. So in 13 games last year, Mike Evans, wide receiver 16, the 8 touchdowns, like we talked about for my projections, 1,157 yards, 67 receptions, 118 targets, and about 17.7 fantasy points per game. So we see Mike Evans have 2 really strong seasons last year, the massive 2018 year. I guess I'm kind of hesitant. I think he's going to be somewhere in maybe his rookie season where the 16.3, I think he's going to be somewhere in that 16 fantasy points per game range. But again, it's a good offense, and you can get him. He's one of those round 3 receivers. But again, I just prefer getting Juju, Allen, Adam Thielen, and DJ Moore just because they don't have as much competition for targets. But Mike Evans, he's a fantastic wide receiver 2 with wide receiver 1 upside. I got Tyler Lockett down here at wide receiver 15. Lockett was fantastic last year until he had his little injury hiccup, and that kind of soured things for his breakout season. But I got him going for 83 receptions, 111 targets, 1,085 yards, and 9 touchdowns. Let's take a look at the Seattle offense real quick. And I guess we'll talk about DK Metcalf later. But I think, how many games did Lockett play last year? So Lockett, wide receiver 13 last year. He did end up playing through his injuries all 16 games, 82 receptions, 1,057 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 110 targets. So career high season, 14.7 fantasy points per game. He doesn't really get a lot of rushing opportunities as he has in the past, but his game chart was pretty crazy because he kind of got hurt. I think it was against San Francisco or maybe it was Minnesota. But he missed some time here towards the end of the year. But again, you look in the playoffs, he destroyed Green Bay. He played fairly well against Philadelphia and for 10 points, but he kind of got things back on the right track. So I think with Tyler Lockett, it's almost got that Amari Cooper thing where his highs are going to be extremely high. You see this week 3 against New Orleans, followed up by the next week of a 9.1. So he's got this crazy variance. He's one of my favorite best ball receivers, I guess. But I think Tyler Lockett's got the potential for career highs all across the board. Targets, reception yards. We'll see about touchdowns. I think the 10 touchdowns is going to be hard to reach, but I got him somewhere in the 8 to 9 touchdown range. And then you're attaching yourself to Russell Wilson. So that's one of my favorite things when I'm thinking about a receiver is who is he attached to? That's just, to me, that's one of my favorite things to think about. So wide receiver 15, Tyler Lockett. Coming in at 16 is A.J. Brown. Now, A.J. Brown, he's almost like he's a tough evaluation because he's got some major boom weeks and he's got some major bust weeks. He's probably a better best ball receiver, but he costs like a 4th round pick. Sometimes I get him at the very end of the 4th, early 5th, and that's where it feels the best. But we see with A.J. Brown, 2019, he finished as wide receiver 21, and he didn't really take flight until Ryan Tannehill took over. I can't remember what week it was, but you see a couple of these, double-digit games, that might be his floor, somewhere 9 to 12 points going forward. But what really concerned me was the playoffs. He played some good defenses here, probably some of the best defenses in New England and Baltimore, and they shut him down. They just took him out of the game, 1.4 and 2.8. So that's really concerning. But when they do play these not-so-good teams like, the Raiders, the Texans secondary is not very good. The Saints secondary isn't the best. And then same with Houston. He's going to blow up against those bad teams. Jacksonville, he's going to eat against Jacksonville probably twice this year. But he's kind of like that Amari Cooper thing where it's hard to trust. He's better as a best ball receiver. I don't think if I'm picking in the 4th round, I think there's other options that I want to look at. But I love watching him play. He makes some of the best plays as a big receiver. Rookie receiver too, over 1,000 yards, 8 touchdowns, 20 yards a catch. And this could be his floor, for a season because they really didn't start throwing him the targets here until we got to Ryan Tannehill taking over. But even then, it's just so hit or miss. Only 1 game over double-digit targets. The next week, 2, 8, 1, 3. So I'm kind of turned off by A.J. Brown. I prefer to get one of those guys that's a little more consistent, whether that's Cooper Kupp, Tyler Lockett's a little bit more consistent. You can wait for Robert. I think Robert Woods goes like in the same neighborhood. So Robert Woods is one of my favorite 4th round picks. And let's just take a quick look at Robert Woods' game log just for comparison. Robert Woods, his bad game is going to be about 5 to 6 points, so that's not as terrible. But he's just a little bit more consistent in the 6th round. And plus, when you think about Brandon Cooks being gone, I mean, look at what he did in 2018. So very consistent from Robert Woods. I think I might lean towards him. My wide receiver was A.J. Brown. Wide receiver 17 is Cooper Kupp. I got him going for 85 receptions, 131 targets, 1,065 yards, and 9 touchdowns. He's going to lead the Rams in touchdowns. I don't think I talked about Robert Woods' touchdowns, but he only had 2 receiving touchdowns last year and 1 rushing. So only 3 touchdowns for Robert Woods last year. That's kind of like DJ Moore, how I talked about. I would bet the over on touchdowns this year, which is why I'm comfortable taking a player that I know has the volume, and he's almost guaranteed to score more touchdowns. So that's something that I really look into. But we got Cooper Kupp here at wide receiver 17. Let's see where he finished last year. He was wide receiver 4. So the thing about Cooper Kupp is he pretty much was what he was in 2018 before he got hurt. About 17 fantasy points per game, which is fantastic. I don't know what happened in the middle of the season here, but it looks like Jared Goff and the Rams offense, I mean, they hit the Steelers, the Bears, and the Ravens, and they just got buzzsawed those 3 weeks, and basically the season went down the tubes. But they got it going again against these not-so-good defenses. Even against San Francisco, he caught a touchdown. But San Francisco clamped him earlier in the year. But you see him at the end of the season finish the season with 5 straight touchdowns in 5 games. So he's the favorite to look at in the red zone, I think. Maybe Tyler Higbee can argue with that. But the thing is, his volume it was really strong volume in the beginning of this season, and then for some reason it was a little less. But he was very consistent. You see 6 for 6, 4 for 4, 6 for 6, 4 for 4. So he's very efficient with Jared Goff. So I'm looking at these kind of numbers as being what Cooper Kupp can offer, and then maybe these 8 to 9 games are his low points. And he doesn't really get a lot of rushing upside. So, but either way, I think Cooper Kupp's a really strong wide receiver too. He might be a guy that I prefer taking over A.J. Brown just because I know week to week he's going to get me 10 to 12 points on a bad week. So I love Cooper Kupp there in the 4th round. Calvin Ridley's another really good wide receiver in the 4th round that you could take. I got him going for 81 catches, 120 targets, almost 1,100 yards and 9 touchdowns. If we look at what Calvin Ridley did last year, he was hurt kind of on and off, and that's been his thing throughout his career right now. He was wide receiver 27 last year. He did play 16 games in 2018, but he kind of was like hurting a hamstring, I think it was that year, his rookie year. And then 2019, he missed 3 games, but he basically put in what he did in 13 games, what he did his rookie year in 16 games. So that's really encouraging. So you see a 15.0 fantasy points per game, and he's got some better consistency down the stretch too. You look at this, he had 3 touchdowns to finish the year in the last 4 games. The targets started to shoot up here, 8, 14, 10, 5. And then again, he's being a little bit more consistent. I don't know, the 6 for 14 is a little weird, but this 8 for 8 against Carolina. Carolina's going to be atrocious this year. And Tampa Bay will be a little bit better, but he's got the NFC South matches to kind of eat up on. And it looks like, I mean, the one outlier here is Indianapolis Colts game, but it looks like a floor of 6 to 8 fantasy points with some big boom weeks. You see a lot of high double digits, a lot of 28s here, 23. Kind of what he did his rookie year, but it looks like he took a step forward and became a little bit more consistent. So I love Calvin Ridley in the 4th round. And I mean, I'm not going to argue if you want to take Calvin Ridley, Cooper Kupp over A.J. Brown just because of the consistency factor. But now we're starting to look at guys that have massive upside, because a guy like A.J. Brown, Kupp, Ridley, even Lockett, all these guys can finish as top 10 wide receivers if their touchdowns are up and if they're making, longer, touchdown plays with yards. So this is kind of where I'm leaning with my draft. Is I'll try to get a top 5 receiver, upside, whether it's Godwin or if I look for Juju or DJ Moore, I try to get one of those guys. But if I can't, I'm stacking up on receivers in the 4th, 5th, 6th round, because that's where I have a lot of these guys as my wide receiver 2s. So coming in at wide receiver 19 is Terry McLaurin. And if you've been watching any of my videos, any of my mock drafts, Terry McLaurin's probably one of my favorite picks in the 5th round. Sometimes he falls, to the mid to late 5th round, and that just feels like a steal. I have been taking him in best ball. He's one of my favorite best ball picks because we really don't know what week it's going to happen. But he plays in the NFC East, so that feels like a division that we can kind of pick on for receivers. But last year, rookie season, Terry McLaurin, wide receiver 29 in only 14 games. We see him with 58 receptions, 93 targets, 919 yards, and 7 touchdowns. That's pretty impressive. So he did kind of have like I think this rookie wall that we see him hit here was kind of the changing of the guard because he comes out banging, right? He came out swinging strong with what's his name? Can't think of it. Was it Case Keenum last year? So Case Keenum and him were in sync. This is really impressive numbers. And then I can't remember if this was the game Keenum got benched or whatever, but Dwayne Haskins comes in. He plays San Francisco, Minnesota, Buffalo, three of the worst, toughest defenses, especially for a rookie. So Haskins kind of struggled there. Then we start to see him turn it around here. I mean, a game against Detroit for 12.2. Darius Slay was on record saying that Terry McLaurin's one of the scariest, receivers that he had to cover all of 2019. That's all pro cornerback Darius Slay saying that. And then we see the last 5 games to end the year, we see some consistency from Terry McLaurin. He had the one kind of stinker against Carolina. Not sure what happened in that game, but he finished really strong with weeks 14, 15, and 16. A couple touchdowns, 130 yards here, 86 yards, roughly 5 to 9 targets is his floor. But the thing that I love about McLaurin this year is they are going to try to move him around a little bit more. They're going to try more to get him the ball. I think about Ron Rivera being the head coach there. And then he brought over, it's not Norv Turner, but it's Scott Turner, who's, I think, Norv's son. So I think they're going to try to use Terry McLaurin in a DJ Moore type way, but also wrinkle in those Curtis Samuel, deep routes, which he excels on so much. So I kind of view Terry McLaurin as a DJ Moore, Curtis Samuel clone rolled up into one. So I'm super excited about McLaurin. There's really not a lot of competition on the depth chart here. We saw their wide receiver 2, Kelvin Harmon, tear his ACL a couple weeks ago. They do have a slot receiver here, Steven Sims. They drafted Antonio Gandy Golden. So McLaurin, I mean, it's going to be a bad team, but they're going to be throwing the ball a lot. The defense is going to be okay. That might actually keep them in some games. But these 93 targets, I see those going up by, maybe 30 or 40. He's going to be somewhere in the 120s and 130 targets this year. So I have him going off for 78 receptions, 132 targets, 1,165 yards, and 8 touchdowns. And he's got a ridiculously high yard share because, think about how is the Washington football team going to move the ball? We don't really know what running back they're going to have try to move the ball, but we know they're going to throw the ball to McLaurin. So he comes in at my wide receiver 3 in terms of yard share, which is a pretty good indicator of how well a player's season goes. So I'm all in on Terry McLaurin. Wide receiver 20 is Michael Gallup. This is another receiver that's a favorite of mine. And I ask you the question, why take Amari Cooper in the 3rd round when you can get Michael Gallup in the 6th round? And that's typically where I get him. Michael Gallup last year in PPR, wide receiver 24. Cooper was wide receiver 10. But Gallup only played 14 games. He averaged 15.2 fantasy points per game compared to Cooper's 15.4. That's not a big difference, not by much at all. In 16 games, you see Amari Cooper with 119 targets. In 14 games, you see Michael Gallup get 113. So Gallup, when he was in, Gallup was the more targeted receiver. And he's going to go for bigger plays. So the receptions are going to be down, but the yards are going to be very similar. You see almost 1,200 yards here for Cooper, and for Gallup, about 1,107. And then a touchdown difference of 8 to 6. So they're very similar. Cooper is just going to get a little bit more reception work, and Gallup's going to go for bigger plays. So I view them very similarly, but I love the value of Michael Gallup there. And then we got wide receiver 21 here, Cortland Sutton, coming in with 73 receptions, 125 targets, almost 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns. I'm probably lower on Cortland Sutton than most guys. The thing about the Broncos offense that I'm nervous about is just that Cortland Sutton was the only game in town last year at receiver. You look at some of these guys, after Sanders left, they're throwing to Deshaun Hamilton, Tim Patrick, Noah Fant was still a rookie. They're not really getting the ball to a lot of other players. And now you're going to add Jerry Jeudy, KJ Hamler. They still have Tim Patrick, Deontay Spencer, but Melvin Gordon enters the targets now too. And then Noah Fant and Albert Ogbongbonam. So there's a lot more mouths to feed there. So I kind of gave Sutton what he had last year. Sutton had 124 targets, 72 catches. I got him at 73 and 125. So I have his yards per catch kind of similar. I do give him more touchdowns. So I have him projected to have a better season than he did last year. But I just think there's going to be a little bit more inconsistencies as Drew Lock is still learning and starting. But if we look at Sutton's numbers with Drew Lock down the stretch last year, I mean, they're not very good. I think Drew Lock played the last 5 games. So that first game with Week 13 against the Chargers that they upset the Chargers, Drew Lock went 4-1, by the way, the last 5 games. That's when he really played well with Sutton. You see 23.4, but then at 8.4, 11.9, a 9.1, and a 9.2. I guess these are all nice floor games. We like the targets, but Drew Lock's not a very efficient quarterback yet. So I'm a little nervous about Cortland Sutton putting up a lot of 8 to 9 point games. And then, his big game is, every 1 or 2, 3 weeks. So he's probably a better best ball receiver, but I do like Cortland Sutton's game. I just think the value right now is a round 4, sometimes a round 5 pick. I think there's other players in that area that I feel a little bit more comfortable about and that are a little bit more consistent for me. Wide receiver 22, I got Marvin Jones coming in with 71 catches, 106 yards, 1,015 yards, and 9 touchdowns. So Marvin Jones last year, he missed a handful of games, just 3 games last year, but he was good enough for wide receiver 28. The thing is, most of his work came into one game. He had the 4 touchdowns against the Vikings last year, 10 receptions, 93 yards, and 4 touchdowns. But you see down the stretch, the guy was kind of balling, putting up some big numbers. He's probably a better best ball receiver because I don't really know what week, we can trust him. You see the Giants game, only 6.2, 3.7 against Green Bay. Basically a floor of maybe 6 to 8 points as being his worst games. But his boom games are pretty strong. We see some high, 19.9, 26.6, 43.3, a 22.1. And then when you factor in, only 8 of these games are with Matt Stafford. The other 5 are with whoever they threw out at quarterback last year. And 9 touchdowns in 13 games. That's a really good ratio. So this points to Matt Stafford being one of my favorite values as a quarterback right now. I love Marvin Jones. I love Kenny Golladay. Both guys are going to eat, and they complement each other really well. Being corners on the outside, they're not going to really compete for targets. Stafford just gets to kind of sit back and take whatever matchup he thinks is going to win. So I love Marvin Jones. Marvin Jones, I have him basically projected for what Cortland Sutton is. So I would say, why take Cortland Sutton in the 4th or 5th round when you can get Marvin Jones in the 7th round, maybe 8th round sometimes? And then you got Tyler Boyd here coming in at wide receiver 23. And the impressive thing with Tyler Boyd is, last year they threw out Ryan Finley and Andy Dalton for a few games. The Bengals offensive line was a mess, but he still finished as wide receiver 17. I know A.J. Green missed some time, but A.J. Green's going to be the outside receiver. Tyler Boyd is locked into the slot. Joe Burrow coming from LSU. What did he do there? He threw the ball to the slot receiver, Justin Jefferson, a ton. And that's going to be, I think, especially for a rookie, he's going to look for those quick routes where I don't know if he's going to be trusting the outside receivers as much right away. So I love Tyler Boyd. He's not going to get the volume that he had last year. You see the 148 targets and the 90 receptions. But I do have him coming in at 128 targets, 82 catches, almost 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns. So I love Tyler Boyd's value there. You can get him in the 6th or 7th round sometimes. So he's just another one of those guys that, to me, he's going to offer a little bit more consistency. We see 14.2 fantasy points per game. But then just, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 games out of the 16 games last year were not very good. But everything else is a pretty safe bet for Tyler Boyd to be at least double digits. And then he'll blow up, every now and then for a 20 or 30-point game. So I love Tyler Boyd. And then finishing out my wide receiver 2s, we got Odell Beckham Jr. coming in at 72 catches, 127 yards, almost 127 targets. I keep doing that. Almost 1,100 yards and 7 touchdowns. So I think he was injured for most of last year. So I kind of viewed that as like his floor. He did have 203.3 fantasy points last year. I have him going for 223.5 fantasy points. So I have him at more touchdowns, more yards, a little bit less targets, and maybe a reception or 2 less. The thing about the Browns offense is they're going from a pass-happy offense to a more dialed-back, we're going to run the ball approach with Kevin Stefanski. So I'm down on Baker Mayfield. I think for Odell Beckham, we're going to be taking him in the 4th round. I just think there's other guys that I find more interesting. But the thing for Beckham is Jarvis Landry. I think he might be on the PUP list to start. We don't really know where his injury recovery is at. So he might be the only game in town. And when you think about the old Minnesota Vikings offenses that Stefanski's been a part of, Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs, even though it was a low volume offense, both those guys boomed. So if Beckham's healthy and good to go and his mind's in the right spot, I think he's one of those receivers that might be worth the risk in a fourth round. I mean, if you compare him to guys like in the area that I have him, so he's going somewhere in the fourth round. But would you take Odell Beckham over Calvin Ridley, Terry McLaurin, Cooper Kupp, even A.J. Brown? That might be the case. That might be one of those guys that I would say it's okay gambling on. He was wide receiver 25 last year. One sec. So as rough as the Browns were last year, he still was wide receiver 25. So that's kind of his floor. I have him at wide receiver 24, but on a weekly basis, that's where it got a little bit frustrating. But I guess now that I look at it, he only really had the 4 bad games, but only 2 games over 20 yards. So he's a little bit more consistent than I thought he was. So maybe I'm changing my mind here. Maybe I'm saying maybe I might have to adjust my rankings. I haven't touched the Browns in a little bit because I've been waiting for this Jarvis Landry updates. So I might actually move Odell Beckham up here by maybe 15 to 20 points, and that would get him somewhere in the 18-19 range. So I'm open to Odell Beckham in the fourth round. So that's going to finish my wide receiver 2s. Let's take I don't know what time I'm at for this video, but I'm going to kind of just reach on some of these guys here really quickly. Keenan Allen, I'm not a fan of the Chargers. He's my 25th receiver. I'm not a fan of the Chargers offense. I don't really know if I trust the quarterback situation or the offensive line. So he's not a guy that's been ending up on my teams, but he's going to be the leading receiver there. DK Metcalf, wide receiver 26. Now he's a guy that I'm more open to drafting, in the 5th, 6th round, just because he's probably got a really good chance at leading the Seattle Seahawks in touchdowns. Year 2 with Russell Wilson. There's really no other competition besides him and Lockett for targets. I would put my money on him getting over 1,000 yards and maybe a guy that can get double-digit touchdowns. He's a fantastic best ball receiver as well. So T.Y. Hilton, I can't remember what the injury was, but I thought I saw T.Y. Hilton had a hamstring or something just came up this week. But I'm also, I guess he kind of fits that Chargers offense to me, where I'm not really sure if I trust him with Philip Rivers. It's a new team, or I guess a new quarterback. Same system, which is nice, but T.Y. Hilton just hasn't been able to stay healthy. When you want to take Hilton in the 5th or 6th round, I think I'd rather prefer a guy like Michael Gallup or wait for Tyler Boyd the next round, or even Marvin Jones around later. So I don't really get a lot of T.Y. Hilton. With DJ Chark, wide receiver 28, I'm open to DJ Chark, but I think I need to see more from DJ Chark. He kind of faded down the stretch last year, which made me turned me off a little bit. He was wide receiver 18, but you see down the stretch, like he was off to such a really good start, and then I don't know what happened. I think it maybe just the Jaguars funk, but I think the highs and lows might be a little bit too much. I typically like to get more consistent receivers, so I don't really get a lot of DJ Chark. And as I say that, I like Marquise Brown here at wide receiver 29, who's probably the definition of a best ball or boom bust type receiver. I get him in a lot of best ball leagues in the 6th round usually, sometimes in the late 5th, depends on if I want to just do it or not. But Marquise Brown, he didn't even really play 100%, with his bum foot last year, so he's probably just scratching the surface of what we can do with him. Lamar Jackson's been pumping him up in recent quotes. We see Marquise Brown was wide receiver 46 last year, played in 14 games, 7 touchdowns, though, which is pretty nice. That's basically a touchdown every other game. So I'm into Marquise Brown. Again, Jarvis Landry, who I have down here at wide receiver 30, I think I might widen the gap between him and Odell Beckham just based on health. I don't really know if Landry's going to be 100% to start right away. So I think he's going to fall a little bit for me. He's really not on my draft board at all right now. Jamison Crowder, wide receiver 31. We see Crowder's one of those sneaky guys. He was wide receiver 26 in a best ball league. I highly recommend checking out Jamison Crowder in the 8th, 9th round of your drafts. He's not going to be very consistent, but he kind of goes in bunches, it looks like. So some really massive games, 1, 2, 3, 4 games over 20 points, a couple high teen games, and just a handful of double-digit games. So I really don't know how much we can trust him on a weekly basis, but I love him in best ball leagues. 1 second. Julian Edelman, wide receiver 32. We'll see if he can develop the chemistry with Cam. It looks like they're doing some good things working out together right now, but he's going to be the leading receiver there. So you could get a wide receiver one pretty late in the 6th or 7th round. Stephon Diggs, kind of the same thing. I'm looking at basically John Brown's 2019 season as his ceiling, with John Brown being wide receiver 22. Stephon Diggs coming in at wide receiver 33, which seems kind of low, but just with more mouths to feed there, you got Diggs, you got John Brown, and you got Cole Beasley, Dawson Knox, and the running backs. I think it might be a little bit watered down for fantasy production, so I kind of stay away from the Buffalo Bills offense in general besides Josh Allen. That's kind of just one of those situations where just give me the faucet that's, dispersing all the water out in the cups. So we got Devontae Parker at wide receiver 34, Deebo Samuel at wide receiver 35. I think I need to drop Deebo Samuel a little bit even lower. So we're going to see some guys, move up there. He's got that foot injury. He might be on the PUP list. AJ Green, I don't really know if I can trust him as my wide receiver 36. But here's this range of 37 to 48. This is where I'm going to give you guys some names that I'm high on. And these are guys that you can add at the end of your draft that could really finish as a wide receiver 3 or better. So I like Deontay Johnson. I like Hunter Renfrow, even Golden Tate, Brandon Cooks, Emmanuel Sanders, Will Fuller. He's got a little bit higher ADP. I think I'd rather have Brandon Cooks. I think he's got a higher percentage of higher probability of finishing, with 14, 15, 16 games under his belt. I love Emmanuel Sanders as the wide receiver 2 in the New Orleans Saints offense. Curtis Samuel is the best ball receiver option. And Preston Williams just got the okay, good to go. He cleared all his medical protocols. So I think I might be moving Preston Williams' numbers up a little bit. I might even pull a little bit from Devontae Parker. I'm not really drafting Christian Kirk. I'm not really drafting CeeDee Lamb just yet. But we did see Randall Cobb finish as wide receiver 42. So if I have him, if Cobb finishes wide receiver 42, this might be CeeDee Lamb's floor. So if you're sitting in the 9th, 10th round, you could get a guy that could be useful, bench player for most part. You see Randall Cobb did have a few nice weeks. So if you are inclined to put in CeeDee Lamb every now and then, and I think at this point, CeeDee Lamb's probably a better receiver than Cobb. So Lamb's one of those interesting guys for me against the Dallas Cowboys offense. I got Steven Sims coming in here. He's the Washington football team's wide receiver 2, slot receiver. And the thing about Steven Sims that was really impressive is you look at what he finished with down the stretch. He was wide receiver 66, but look at his last few games with Dwayne Haskins: 11, 10, and 8 targets, 4 touchdowns in 3 games. Really nice stuff here from the slot receiver. So I like Steven Sims. And then I got Anthony Miller, Allen Lazard, Rashad Perriman, Mecole Hardman. These are probably some of my end game targets where if I can get any of these guys as my wide receiver 5 or 6, I'm feeling really good. So, but that's basically my top 50. I really don't know if I need to call out any of these other receivers, but I like Michael Pittman Jr. because I'm kind of nervous about T.Y. Hilton. I like Sterling Shepard. I might have to move him up a little bit. I'm not as high on Darius Slayton. I love Randall Cobb as the slot receiver there. Even James Washington's kind of an interesting best ball guy. So, but for the most part, I think I discussed everyone that's going to be used on a weekly basis for redraft leagues. But yeah, that's going to pretty much wrap up the wide receiver video. If you like any of my projections or my calls, let me know in the comments below. Who are you vibing with? Who is my best receiver call? Tell me my worst receiver projection. I don't care which side you're on. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. If you're listening on any of the podcasting platforms, I highly recommend checking us out on YouTube. That's where I do the screen shares, and I just think you get a little bit more value. And then if you're on YouTube, comment, and subscribe to the channel as we grow to this thing. We just got to 30 subscribers, so that's really cool. And we've almost got 2,000 total views on our videos, so that's really cool. So I just want to say thank you, and we'll see you in another video. Peace.